Okay, so this little screencast is on organic macromolecules, and it's primarily going to focus on how to identify them. So first off, from our chemistry little intro, what does it mean that it is organic? An organic macromolecule does not mean that it's grown without pesticides or herbicides or anything like that. It's not like organic food. When we say organic, we're talking about that the macromolecule has carbon in it, and carbon is truly the molecule of life. So living things contain a lot of carbon. And when we look at this here, we can see that carbon has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. So the protons and neutrons are in here. Neutrons have no charge, neutral charge. Protons are positive, and electrons have a negative charge and exist in orbitals around outside the nucleus. And we said that the first orbital can hold up to 2 electrons, and then in what it would be its valence shell, there can be 4. And this is what makes carbon so special. By having 4 valence electrons, it has a wide variety in ways that it can bond with other things, and it makes it a great molecule for that. So one of the other big things we're going to do is understand what they're made out of, what the structure is of these. And again, we will get to ATP when we talk more about energy, but right now we're focusing on carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So structure and function is what we're going to focus on here. But today we're really going to focus on how can we identify it based off of its chemical structure. And I'm going to give you some hints. So if you see a chemical structure here, again, they all have carbon, right? But it would be a carbohydrate if it only contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And a lot of times, one thing that will tip you off, if you see any N's or P's here, it's definitely not a carbohydrate. A lot of time, we will see these represented in hexagons or pentagons. So if it is a hexagon shape or a pentagon shape, that will tip you off that it could be a carbohydrate. The other thing here, and specifically a sugar in this case. So this is a simple single sugar. It's glucose. If a word ends in ose, it's probably a sugar. A sucrose is 2 of them bound together, and it's a disaccharide, 2 sugars put together. Okay, so let's take a look at another. Again, you might be able to see it in a straight line fashion as opposed to a hexagon shape, but again, it's going to be simple, and you'll see what I mean by simple versus complex when we take a look at some fatty acids. But we only have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that should tip you off that it's a carbohydrate. Now, this is a complex carbohydrate, and it's a polysaccharide. So glycogen, which is how we store excess carbohydrates within our liver and in some skeletal muscles, is by linking together all of these glucoses. So again, you can see the hexagon shape, and it's a whole bunch of hexagons because it's complex. Okay, so again, carbohydrates here, hexagons and pentagons, and this is just showing how they can bond or come apart with hydrolysis. But again, the idea, it's carbohydrates, carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens only. Carbon, hydrate, water, H2O. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And they're fairly simple, and they are hexagons or pentagons. Now, when we start talking about lipids in the chemistry intro, I mentioned about how water is a polar covalently bonded molecule. It's a polar molecule, and here would be the positive hydrogen ends and the negative oxygen side of the water molecule. And this gets important when we start talking about phospholipids, because phospholipids make up cell membranes. And it's the phosphate non-lipid part here, this head, that is polar. and it's attracted to the positive end of the hydrogen molecules. So the actual lipid part of a phospholipid is the glycerol and the two fatty acids. And this is where I want you to pay attention, that this is much more complex than a carbohydrate. It's these long chains of carbons and hydrogens hooked together when energy is stored in these bonds. So again, it's a complex combination of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Again, when we look at these things, we are seeing that there is only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. There isn't the nitrogen in lipids. Okay, again, a lipid here. This is a triglyceride. Here's a glycerol and 3 fatty acid tails that come off. So again, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, more complex than carbohydrates. And they form and bond and break apart the same way. Organic macromolecules go through dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis, where water comes in and water goes out. But again, we have long fatty acid tails and a glycerol group. Okay, so proteins. Proteins contain nitrogen, so that makes them different. They also have this central carbon within the amino acid, and we always have this NH2, this amino group. This is just a single little nitrogen for each amino acid. And then this variable side chain. On the periodic table, you don't see anything with an R, but this could be a variety of different things, a variety of different elements attached here. All other amino acids are identical in this area, and this is how they're different. When you attach a bunch of amino acids together, you make a protein. Again, a central carbon, this variable R group, the amino group, this is where the nitrogen exists, NH2, and then you also have this carboxylic acid group. We use this to really pinpoint it, a central carbon in the amino acid, a variable group, and our NH2. Again, a protein is a complex combination of amino acids. The average size protein is 400 of these put together. So when we look at this, we're not going to see 400 of these. That's quite a complex drawing. But if we see a central carbon, variable side chains, and nitrogenous groups here, this little nitrogen, this amino group, the NH2, that will tip us off that it is a protein. Amino acids make up dipeptides, which make up polypeptides. So if you hear the word peptide, we're talking protein. Again, central carbon. This is the variable side chain. This is the R. Glycine is the simplest amino acid. It only has a single hydrogen here. Alanine, its R group is CH3, and that's what makes this amino acid different from this amino acid. And again, a central carbon, an amino group that contains nitrogen. Nucleic acids. This is what our DNA and RNA is made up of inside of our nucleus. So we have one phosphate. You should see a phosphate here. You should see a sugar. So when we talk about DNA, we're talking about deoxyribose nucleic acids. So a deoxyribose is the sugar. And then the nitrogenous base, again, this is a complex group of nitrogens here. And this nitrogenous base, when we think about letters of the DNA code, this is what we're talking about. And one group of this is called a nucleotide. A nucleotide is a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogenous base. DNA is made up of, millions of nucleotides, and each RNA molecule probably has thousands. So if the average size protein is 400 amino acid, 3 nucleotides code for um, a single amino acid, which we'll get to later when we talk about genetics. But we are talking about the average size messenger RNA being at least 1,200 nucleotides, 1,200 of these put together. So when we look at a nucleic acid, these sugars and phosphates make the backbone, and the bases hang off as letters of the code. Again, sugars and phosphates make up the sides of the double helix. The nitrogenous base makes up the letters of the code, and then we have the A's, the T's, the G's, the C's, the U's. Again, that's the nitrogen part. Here's the sugar part and the phosphate part. Again, RNA is single-stranded, DNA is double-stranded, a double helix. So these are the nitrogenous bases, which are the letters of the codes, and the sugars and the phosphates make up the backbone. Now, ATP is also a nucleotide, so it is a nitrogenous base, a sugar, but it has 3 phosphates, and these extra phosphates attached is where we store energy inside living things, but we'll save a little bit of that for cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Okay, so first practice problem. You have 4 choices: carbohydrate, lipid, protein, or nucleic acid. And again, we're seeing one small part of the larger macromolecule, but what type is this? All right, here we go. Second one. What type of macromolecule is this? All right, this is a nucleotide. It's actually ATP because it has 3 phosphate groups here. So if you thought this looked kind of like a nucleic acid, you'd be right on track. What type of molecule is this? How about this one? All right, what is this one? How about this one? Another practice. And that is all of our practice ones.